and whatever you want me to do, I'm here for you.
Awesome. All right. Well, welcome, Jeff. You're on the Political Hope Show, but whoa, like political hope, like what is going on with politics and hope? But before we even get into that, I just want to acknowledge you and the work you've done so far in building community. You have the Commune, which is an amazing source of information and knowledge and community. That's really awesome, and it's been regulated and it's such a great feel. I've personally experienced it. But then you also have been producing Wanderlust for many years. And so with that whole space, how'd you get here? Like Jeff, like give us a little bit of explanation. How'd you get here, like right now, 2021?
Here right now, well, literally in this guest house is a result of, as we were speaking earlier, of my house defying statistical odds and being hit by lightning, which has pushed me into a very humble situation. So if you're asking why I haven't shaved and I'm sitting in a somewhat crooked, cockeyed guest house, that's the reason, which is more of this current moment. But I suppose what you're really getting at is a little bit of the more or the broader strokes of my life. And I was a musician, really, and come from a musical family. My grandfather um, made the ludicrous choice to eschew his career as a cardiologist and take up gypsy
Oh my
violin. So as you can see, there's a streak of madness that runs congenitally through my family, and not necessarily always making uh, choices for the greatest monetary gain. But I was a musician. I worked in the music industry, kind of coming out of college, and I was a DJ on a radio program. It's very intra-traditional American music and its kind of relationship to history and ethnomusicology. And I started a record label and management company, started making records in the kind of financial district of Manhattan. I had a little studio that I built down there, and I was a one-man show for a number of years, producing
Wow.
hip hop, producing hip hop demos right off the
What?
street.
You were
And
doing hip hop? I would never imagine hip hop
oh,
would
come
be your.
on, I was doing anything that would come off the street. That was it. I just had an ad in the Village Voice, and I
What?
was, just making beats and producing stuff for people and mixing their records and whatnot.
What,
Anyways,
what what would you say your for like what how did you pick up the musical quality from your family? Like were you good at just beats or producing, or did you play instruments or?
oh yeah, I played it. I mean, yeah, the beats thing was almost superfluous and or parenthetical. Um, yeah, really, we were a family of analog, technicians, if you will. We had, guitars and pianos and even some horns in the house. So I would play hooky from school and, apply myself in ulterior ways. So, and then became obsessed with the banjo through my college years. And um, I was, as I mentioned, a DJ on the radio station up at Columbia University, which at that juncture was transmitted off the World Trade Center, so it actually had a bit of reach. And they gave me just enough coin to hop in my station wagon and travel through the Southeast with my banjo, going to bluegrass festivals. And oftentimes I'd book myself as like, the first of 30 musicians on a Saturday, wake up at 7:30 and hit the stage with about four people there. But that got me backstage with an analog tape recorder, and I was able to interview kind of all those first generation men, really, white men from the South, about traditional American music, which was a window into all sorts of interesting, crazy, twisted, wicked culture. Um,
Wow.
but yeah, all those first generation guys, Earl Scruggs, Bill Monroe, J.D. Crowe, Ralph Stanley,
Wow.
and then the newer guys that were coming up too. And and yeah, so I just had a love affair, with music, still do. Um, but kind of a long, there was this one particular inflection point that I suppose bent the arc of my professional and my personal life. I was running a record label in Lower Manhattan, just about 2 blocks north of the World Trade Center when 9/11 happened. And so I wasn't actually there in the office that day because it was too early in the morning. Our
Oh
office
my
hours
gosh.
were a little bit later, but but our office was right in the little radius there around the trade center, and they let us back in. I think maybe 3 weeks out just to gather stuff. But
What streets were you at? I used to live in downtown Manhattan.
we're on Murray Street, and
Okay.
then subsequently Warren Street, so about two to 3 blocks north of
Very
the trade
close.
center there.
Yeah, I lived in Two Gold. So it's
Okay, yeah,
right down the
yeah.
road. Yeah.
Yeah, I lived in Brooklyn at that juncture. Well, I lived in Brooklyn for a very, very long time, but I lived in Brooklyn right across the river in Brooklyn Heights at that juncture, and then subsequently moved to Williamsburg for a really long time. Yeah, I mean, in the aftermath of 9/11, um, a lot of folks moved out of the building where I had had my offices,
Mhm.
and they were mostly like creative photo studios and things like that. So, people moved farther upstate or out
Mhm.
into Brooklyn, and my wife Skylar, who's a yoga teacher, was inspired to open a yoga studio at Ground Zero. So she
Whoa.
did. She got it open in January, February 2002. So pretty soon after access was granted down there, and
Mhm.
it was literally right above my office. And there had been ash and debris blown through the windows of our
Wow.
office. So we literally she opened a yoga studio, as kind of often say, out of the ashes of 9/11.
Wow.
And then that place uh, became kind of an epicenter for um, the denizens of Lower Manhattan to come and sweat and do yoga, but
Mhm.
really to form community
Mhm.
and heal. And this was well before there was a yoga studio every other block.
Mhm.
Of course, that crisis strangely bookended with this crisis. All the yoga studios are gone again. But
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
in fact, my wife opened it on the kind of in the aftermath of 9/11 and closed it this past summer because of COVID. Um,
Hmm.
so that was a long run, that one particular studio. And it was not an Equinox or by any means. It was a very, very humble little cockeyed studio up a bunch of lime green steps and,
Mm.
small little room. But, I got a front row seat to witness the potency of yoga, but even more community to really help people heal and
Mhm.
to rediscover their creative spark. And there are a lot of tears, a lot of hugs on that little futon or whatever that was right outside the practice room where people would congregate, post yoga with kind of their hearts and heads a little bit more open. And yeah, so that was a really powerful experience to watch kind of transformation happen right in front of my eyes, particularly, as Lower Manhattan, it's very identified with the financial district, but it's
Mhm.
actually quite a residential district.
Mhm.
So there was a lot of mostly women, but people of all sorts that were, looking for a way to find connection in that time.
Short people are people live on top of each other but don't know each other, for the
Yeah.
most part. So that's nice that you guys provided a place for people to connect.
Yeah, and that community really grew and stayed strong and actually remains very strong, to this day. So that was really my first kind of introduction to yoga and I suppose mindful living in general. I mean, I was always very like politically oriented. My dad worked in the government. He worked for Carter. So current affairs and politics were always a centerpiece in my life. And, I recognized the the link between the yoga community or the wellness community and many of the sort of progressive ideals that it once was connected to, and in some ways still is.
Sure.
But I saw um, some commonality there
Yep.
between kind of what my kind of political understanding of the world was, and some of the precepts um, within the traditions of yoga. And so I was very enchanted and by that world, and but I also knew music, and I all my many of my friends and contemporaries were starting some of the biggest music festivals around that time. Bonnaroo was a little bit later, but right there,
Mm,
and Austin City Limits. And so I was managing bands, and I was backstage at all of those festivals as they were just kind of in their early efflorescence. And I, I was skilled in production and bringing product to market and ticketing and look and feel and website functionality, and a lot of the things that at that juncture were completely absent
mhm.
from the world of yoga. And the yoga industry was in its
Infinity.
utter infancy at that juncture. So I was able to bring a whole skill set into that world. And I started my wife started leading retreats to Costa Rica, and I would kind of bump along on a puddle jumper into the back of a truck and shake my way out to an eco paradise in the Osa Peninsula. And I'd wake up with the sun and meditate and surf and do
Mhm.
yoga and eat the quote unquote local food or whatever's the food that was there. And really be in community, kind of away from uh, any kind of digital pervasiveness. And I'd look around and I say, wow, here's 30 mostly millennial women, but but not always, really living their fullest and most expressed life. Um, and if I, could I leverage the skill set that I have to bring this to 3,000 people instead of 30 people? Could I amass all of the thought leaders and teachers in the space into one place of natural splendor, but also make it an hour and a half from a major metropolitan center, make it not as expensive, et cetera, provide greater access to that, and create sort of the world's largest yoga retreat, somewhere between, I suppose, at that juncture, Yoga Journal Conference and Lollapalooza.
Mhm.
And that was the question that was posed deep in the heart of the rainforest of Costa Rica. And then it was a slog, a lot of chopping wood and carrying water to
Yeah.
actually instantiate that into the world. But we did, and we had the first Wanderlust Festival in 2009, and brought together, man, like just all of these incredible teachers that then became the biggest influences in my life. Certainly yoga teachers, but then also, thought leaders and
Mhm.
philosophers and writers and personal development, um, mystics and sages. Wayne Dyer came, and he really became my first teacher in the personal growth space, and I became immersed in his work, and
Mm.
build friendships with Deepak and Marianne Williamson, and people in the functional medicine space, and people in the regenerative agriculture space, and these kind of the sort of the diaspora of well-being. And that was really truly transcendent sort of epiphanous time of my life. Just so many doors opening
Mhm.
through the the building of relationships with exceptional people, and really bringing people together at scale. And that that has been sort of the through line of a otherwise jagged career path. Of For me, it's always been about that thread has always been about community creation, from putting 1,000 people venue to listen to a band, to have some kind of transcendental experience, to, putting, 5,000 people on the side of a mountain to do yoga, or, in some iterations doing that digitally, with Commune. And my wife and I also have a retreat center up in Topanga. So, when that's actually functioning, um, which it isn't now, obviously, because of COVID, that's become a joy too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm curious about this. As you've been growing, and like both your projects, over the past almost 15 years have been focused on building community. And so, what do you think what's your opinion on community, like the relationship between community and political hope, right? Like, what's the relationship there? Like, is there a relationship, or is that?
Yeah, there certainly is. I mean, I think that, um, in its best expression, politics is community. Um, the public square as this, as a place for kind of the marketplace of ideas, for public discourse, for this kind of John Stuart Mill concept that through the free exchange of ideas, the best ones will cream to the top. And so at its best, that's what it is. I also just think, we focus so much on, the presidential election every 4 years, but what really impacts and influences your life on a day-to-day perspective is local politics. And a lot of that is just can be very, very community oriented. Now, I think we've lost touch with a lot of that, and we can explore that, a little bit. But I also think the ways, if I look at the political invective right now, sort of the invidious barbs that sort of get exchanged on Facebook, you have these entrenched positions on the left and then these entrenched positions on the right, and everyone's sort of looking down their nose with, indignation, kind of pointing at each other in one way or another. And that's not a particularly profitable project there in terms of being able to find common ground. And the real hope is that is common ground, because
Mhm.
all of society's like great projects have been predicated on the human ability to cooperate flexibly at scale. So when we're not cooperating flexibly at scale, whether that's like building the pyramids or like
Mhm.
electing a president, whatever it is, agreeing on aspects of a social contract, when we're not being able to cooperate flexibly at scale, society begins to break down, social cohesion starts to disintegrate. You get situations like with COVID in the United States, which isn't really it's a public health issue for sure,
Mhm.
but it's also like a political issue.
Mhm.
The political component of it has made the public health component of it much, much, much worse. So generally, I find that like that kind of conversation that happens often on social media, um, where it's just people kind of in these polarized, entrenched positions that sort of reinforce through confirmation bias, like nothing really
Mhm.
yields from there.
Mhm.
So oftentimes, where you really see, um, progress is inside of community.
Mhm.
Like, there's a massive debate, right, about vaccination, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
people are very skeptical about what some people deem as like a rushed vaccine. Some people are like, no, you've got to believe in the science, kind of, et cetera. But if you kind of look back through the history, for example, of vaccines, there's always been some skepticism,
Mhm.
but generally people have vaccinated at very, very high rates, not because like someone shamed them into doing it, but it's because the community coalesced around some sort of notion of the collective good and
Mhm.
common and shared sacrifice. And like, look, there's kids that are compromised. Those are the ones we should really be looking out for. If we vaccinate our children, we're actually doing them a service and all this kind of stuff. I don't want to get into necessarily vaccine think,
But
but it's like, but if you find, but you can look at other iterations of that same thought experiment and look and see where sort of community becomes sort of the glue around which people can cooperate. And so, I'm like, that's my great hope, is that we were able to sort of, I suppose, like conjure a community again at scale. But there's a lot of forces, um, fighting against that right now. And I think that's there's symptoms of
Mhm,
our societal ills all over the place. But if
mhm,
you look at the disease, it's really that sits behind a lot of these arguments. It's the inability to cohere around some sort of intersubjective understanding of the world, around truth, around fact. Like, we can vehemently debate, um, you know, we can vehemently debate the degree for by for example, like, we can debate about social services, like
right,
how much how many social services should the government deploy in the United
right.
States, like Medicaid, Medicare, farm subsidies, but you can go on
Commitment.
and on and on.
Yeah.
But to call it socialism is an epistemological problem. You know what I mean? And so this is the problem right now, is a problem of epistemology. Like, we basically just have like a group of polarized people on one side arguing one set of facts, and another group on another side arguing another set of facts. They're actually not
No.
arguing about about what the best policy might be
Mhm.
that would yield the best result. They're just arguing a separate set of facts, and that's a problem.
Sure, it's like a teenage drama gone like wrong, you know? Like it's like high school issues at the
Yeah.
federal level. I mean, and I would throw this in there. You know, when I was studying, when I went to India and I started advising on at an orphanage. One of the guys who runs it, who's now a good friend and a teacher of mine, he taught me. He introduced Nagarik Shastra to me, and which is the yoga, the yoga of politics, the yoga of governance. And so if the Vedas have like compendiums of knowledge, right, about this, but it's funny. And so even I grew up here in America and Canada, and I'm Indian. We didn't learn about how important this is in our ethos, right? And in yoga philosophy, you very rarely does yoga teacher training talk about politics or governance, you know? And I think that's very important right now. We need to like start thinking about how do we also bring to the people who are healthier, the people who have more energy, who have more well-being, access to well-being, they probably have more resilience to be in political spaces, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's, your show, or the title of this series, Political Hope, is very much inspired by Charles Eisenstein, who's a friend and obviously great influence, for me in my work and the way I try to understand the world. And y- some part of what Charles really hopes for is that we have the discernment that we can cultivate, and many of us use meditation for this, but that we can cultivate a certain kind of discernment that allows us the sort of the space between an event or the stimuli and the reaction or the response, such that we can actually ask the question behind the argument. And for me, like, when I am hopeful, and I'm not always hopeful, to be honest, but when I am hopeful, I really try to I'm in that space where I'm accessing the argument behind, or the question behind the argument. And Charles uses this example, and I'll just kind of reiterate it here, but and you can apply this thought experiment
Mhm.
in a variety of iterations. But like, take for example, like abortion, or immigration, and any kind of incendiary issue that's argued from entrenched positions, with little profit.
Mhm.
And if you look at, like, immigration, for example, you've got folks on the left that make this argument of like, well, America is the land of opportunity, and we've got a statue in a harbor, brandishing an Emma Lazarus poem, and you guys are xenophobes, and even worse, you're racist, and all this kind of stuff. That's kind of what's happening in the entrenched position on the left, and then you've got an equally polarized kind of argument on the right, which is like, the liberals are all anarchists, and like they believe in open borders, and there's criminals flowing into our country that are disrupting and undermining our way of life, that are pilfering our jobs, so this is like,
Yeah.
this is what's going on in that particular issue. And what's never really asked is like, and I mentioned my house blew up, so I've got people working on the house trying to like put it back together. And so like I met this guy, Manuel. He is from Oaxaca, from Mexico. He's like the apprentice for this electrician.
Cool.
Just a sweet guy. He's been here in the United States for 3 years. And so when he left Oaxaca, he left his wife and his daughter, Anna, behind. And he hasn't actually seen them in the flesh for 3 years. And so he speaks English like, okay, and I speak like Spanish like, okay, so kind of worse. So we were making kind of like Spanglish, like small talk. And I'm asking him about like his family and whatnot. And then I'm thinking like, what are the conditions that must exist that would compel Manuel to leave his country, to leave his family, to leave his identity for a strange country with a different language that probably doesn't even want him, knowing that he might not even get in. And if he does, the best case scenario is that he's living in someone's garage, sending 10, 20 bucks a month back home. Like when you start to like ask that question,
Yeah.
there's a lot more common ground
Oh yeah.
that can be found because it's human.
Yeah.
It's not like you're an anarchist or you're a xenophobe. It's like this, what are those conditions that would create that circumstance? And what are our responsibilities, if any, that we have to the creation of those conditions?
Yeah.
So, I
It's
mean, this is,
it's
yeah.
it's a that's a fascinating thought experiment. I mean, I think also we kind of have to pay attention to, these like natural tendencies for us to be both like moving towards like a liberal kind of thinking and moving towards a conservative, right? That neither are like, they're both important, right? Like they're both like actual natural tendencies, right? For us to protect our space, for us to protect our home, and then also to go out and travel and go explore. And like those two things, liberal and conservative tribalism, is like important, but like they need to work together, not like against each other, because you need those elements in a society, right?
Yeah, I'm not even sure what those terms mean anymore because my wife's grandfather, Ellsworth Grant, smoked a pipe. He was a conservative, and he was like the biggest environmentalist I probably ever met. Like not just like a performative environmentalist. He cleaned up the Connecticut River. Like he led that for 40 years and voted for Bush, but he also voted for, I think, Obama at the very end of his life. But, he was, but, conservative once meant conservationist, like conservative once meant that you had fiscal responsibility, that you minded things like the national debt. That is, there's no connection there anymore. So I don't even really know what that means. Liberal, on the other hand, means like that you're tolerant for a plurality of ideas,
Oh,
you know?
I thought it meant liberally bombing any place you want.
Right.
I thought we liberally
Yeah.
bomb.
Uh, and now what we see, from certain factions of the liberal part of the party is that, unless you subscribe to its orthodoxy, you're canceled, you're a racist, or whatever.
Mhm.
It's always like pointing a finger, not for any reprehensible like action that someone might take, but just merely for their politics. So these notions of like what's conservative and what liberal have, you know, in my mind, it's like have are in the dustbin.
Well, that kind of comes back to like, refocusing the question for you, and what I would love for you to answer is, how do we seed political hope, right? And how do we seed it in a tangible, effective way? Because I mean, what you're talking about when we're talking about federal politics and we're talking about like federal, like it's forget about it. It almost seems like pointless to spend a lot of energy and focus there. And you talk about local. How do we seed political hope? Like, how if anybody listening to this, how could we actually show up?
Yeah, it's not very sexy. But you have a photo here, at least in my view, of a tiny a seed growing into like a little seedling coming out of some soil. And I think, you know, it often the enormity of the world can feel very paralyzing and numbing, especially the way we ingest it, which is oftentimes like, on your phone and social media, like fucking Ted Cruz and like some, 11 other wankers are gonna like, try to not confirm the bot, like whatever. This is like all the messages that we're coming at that are like way up here, and it's very easy to feel powerless in that kind of situation. But I think again, it comes back to the local and taking what you can control and empowering yourself. And I mean, sure, you can get involved in local politics. That's one way of doing it. But there's also just the simple exercise of committing yourself to conversations. And I mean, I've been a proponent of really like hard, thorny, difficult conversations are really the mechanism that stands between us. And to quote Charles, the world our hearts know is possible. So, what I try to do in my own tiny, minuscule way is to engage with people that don't agree with me and do it in a thoughtful and respectful and humanizing way in order to take at least one step onto a bridge of common ground, of common humanity. Oftentimes it comes from humanity first, and then you can get
Yeah.
into the thornier bits of issues. Um, and so, I really, I personally try to make an effort and try to model ways of sort of nonviolent communication, of reaching across, quote unquote, the chasm or the aisle to engage with people who I might disagree with, but never be disagreeable in that. And, um, and really, seek out the best parts of other people's positions. There's this technique that I first saw modeled in a debate between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson.
I've seen that. I know.
Yeah, where it's called steel manning, which is sort of I think derived from straw manning.
Yeah.
Straw manning is when you prop up a straw man to refute an argument, but you haven't really refuted the argument. You've just knocked down a straw man because a straw man is very easy to knock down. And there's an argument, but you've kind of triangulated that and said, well, you're just a xenophobe, so that's why you believe in that particular but that's not really
Mm-mm.
refuting the argument. Steel manning is kind of the opposite, where it's like you actually listen, you engage in active listening, you ingest someone's opinion, someone's argument, you deduce, like, or you take the very, very best parts, the most compelling parts of that argument, and then you recite it back as if it were your own. And it's an unbelievable personal development exercise, not just a great way to find common ground, but it also fortifies your own positions because you're like, wait a minute, I'm going to need to critically think about that piece of that person's argument, and I'm going to need, and and I think what you find oftentimes if you engage in this what's called steel manning, um, you often find that issues are way more complicated and nuanced in reality than any particular sort of entrenched, polarized,
Mhm.
viewpoint. And as as sort of a burgeoning Buddhist, um, I generally find that the middle way, that's kind of the truth is
Mhm.
hidden somewhere in the gray zone. Um,
Mhm.
and I know that this is frustrating for people who have really strong moral convictions about something. I mean, it's not that I don't, but I also, recognize that somebody else might have an equally convicted ethic. Like I look at like abortion, probably like white man talking about abortion. It's like a trapeze over the third rail. But it's like, but I look at that issue, and again, it's like the immigration issue that we just talked about. You have one person saying like, "I can't believe that you don't, respect the sanctity of human life. That's a moral conviction for me. How can you not?" And then you have the
Yeah.
other side. "I can't believe you don't,
Right.
respect the woman's right to choose what to do with
Yeah.
her own body, and
Right.
legal abortion is safe abortion. And why do you don't want the government in your life? So why do you want the government in my life? All this kind of shit. This
Yep.
is this is the thing.
Yep.
But I think, what I've tried to, and I've been like, pro-choice or pro-reproductive freedom my whole life. I grew up in a progressive household, and and that's just kind of like what the world.
Sure.
That's the world. That's what structuralism has done to me. Um, but I can also now, I think, respect that
Mhm.
someone who is pro-life might have come to that position through deep moral and ethical conviction.
Yes. Yes.
And I may not agree with that from this is the best policy uh, for a country or for a world or whatever, for a whole variety of reasons.
Mhm.
Um, but I can respect the fact that in that particular case, if that person is intellectually honest about it, that they may have a true, honest moral conviction. And that moral
True.
conviction should not necessarily, my moral stance in that particular case, I don't think can take primacy
Mm-mm.
over theirs. So then why not, again, move behind the argument and say, what are the conditions in which a woman might decide to willfully terminate her pregnancy?
Right.
Like, was she raped? Uh, was she unfortunately like a victim of incest?
Right.
Had she never had any education around family planning or any
Mm.
access to contraception? Does she have no financial wherewithal? Like, if you start to put yourself into the position of what it must be like, the ground conditions that exist, of what it must be like to have to willfully make that
Sure.
decision, it's like, whew, all that other shit starts, like that invective
Right.
starts to disappear, and you're like, wow, there's compassion here. There's a real human
Yeah.
having to make a like heart-wrenching decision.
Right.
And if you can connect in that space with someone that might have a different policy viewpoint, it's so much more constructive.
You will face cognitive dissonance. I've noticed that in my 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 forays into having those conversations, those difficult ones. But I think that's kind of like that's where we have to be artistic and dance, right? Like cognitively dance, right? So when there is cognitive dissonance, we can't just be like, oh, we're like upset that somebody. You got to understand, there's years of entrainment that people have from the media they watch, the community they live in, the religion they whatever. There's so much layers
Yeah.
that we have to kind of peel. I wanted to bring up something with you. I'm curious about this. We've been developing this platform to gamify civic engagement at a local level. And it's me and a bunch of citizens. We started working on this when the pandemic kicked because we're like, hey, we need to do something. And so we got programmers on board, like phenomenal we got somebody in cybersecurity. And one of the things that we've been kind of like playing, you brought up NVC, nonviolent communication, which I recommend for everybody to kind of dive down that rabbit hole. But one of the things we've been kind of like redirecting everything. We're like, wait, we're trying to, how do we engage people? How do we get people to use the platform? How do we get them to incentivize to use the platform? And what was popping up over and over again are values. Like, I think what I noticed when I travel the country, and you traveled the South, the Southeast and everything, like at the end of the day, we all share the same values. Like, it's crazy, Jeff, like that we like at the end of the day, really the values, even from the left or right, are like the same values.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, as I've tried to, I mean, this is a little slightly tangential, but as I've tried to dive into kind of structures of ethics and morality and understand kind of where they come from, where I have landed on that same notion that behind all of these different identities, whether they're political or religious or other ways that we might cubbyhole ourselves, there is a moral intuition that is strong and universal, that like before Moses held up a stone tablet etched with "thou shalt not kill," like we had a sense that murder was not ethically justifiable, right?
Mhm.
So like these religions and these political systems are helpful sometimes as like heuristics to understand morality and the, story around morality that creates sort of an imagined order out of what might otherwise be chaos. But behind all of those things, there is some sort of intuitive, universal, perennial set of ethics and truth. And but how we exhume that and how we actually express that notion when people are so wedded to their particular identities, I think is very, very difficult. Um, it's like I have tremendous discussions, conversations about religion, for example, like Abrahamic religions, and like,
Mhm.
is there utility to religion in a modern age? Where and certainly, you know, there is this there is like notions of community creation that are very, very strong in religion that are extremely important. Again, there's sort of moral structures that we can look to uh, religions kind of as heuristics to
Mhm.
explain morality. Um, but how do we square that, with a book, that condones like public stoning of homosexuals, or execution of an apostate, or if you're not a virgin on your wedding night, well, of course you should be killed too. Like this is what's in those books,
Yeah.
and so this is a great challenge, I think, for us. It's like, what are the methods by which we can recognize like our common morality, our common values, because most of us, unless we're deranged, we're sort of all more or less want the same thing.
Mhm. Mhm.
We want the maximization of well-being for as many people as possible, and the minimization of suffering for as many people as possible. That's a common goal that all sort of non-deranged people share. So this is where, like, and then the moral pathway is the pathway to achieve those goals, such that the needs of the many are met, sometimes at the expense of the needs of the few. And like this is like, it's a utilitarian sort of argument. But all in all, I think people would agree with that. Um, but
It's
uh,
it's
but
funny.
yeah, this
It's funny you say deranged and non-deranged, and like I've my personal experience of moonlighting at different city halls and like meeting with city officials and meeting with people who are in administrative levels is there's a lot of deranged people making decisions. There's a lot of
yeah.
unhappy, unwell people who are making decisions for us right now, which is also really important for us. I mean, you're in yoga and meditation and Buddhist philosophy. It's kind of missing in the space. There isn't that there isn't a Marcus Aurelius thinking in government,
Mhm.
right? Um,
No, yeah, it's funny. Like I've been reading, just starting to learn about Stoicism, and the roots of Stoicism and Seneca and kind of the varying different philosophies that were happening in that time. And like the Stoics, I mean, this was a big part of political life. I mean, political life meant something completely different. It meant your public life. It didn't mean Donald Trump or like whatever. It didn't mean Republican or Democrat, whatever. It meant your life out in public, you know, engaging freely in the discussion of ideas and like, you know, eh, like people and this notion of like ideal societies and how do we instantiate them and what are the best ideas that are going to get us there. I mean, this is what people engaged in. If you look at that period between sort of like 500 BC, maybe a little bit before that, and then the next 600-700 years, um, the amount of like political theory and religion and philosophy that sprang forth out of that time. I mean, it's like it's unbelievable, and so and many of uh, the leaders, the political leaders of that time, were actually philosophers.
yeah, yeah.
And I mean, Marcus Aurelius, or like, there were these moments where actually the smartest man on earth was also the leader. That's like we're so far away from that now. It's just like all we get is word salad.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's kind of where the next stage is. I think of if in the positive, the optimistic perspective is the political hope perspective is that let's bring more heuristics and a little bit more philosophy to the decision makers, to the people who make decisions at every level. I mean, Jeff, you've interacted with so many people. It's in almost every industry, right? Like you can go into entertainment or education or any industry. The administrations are really suffering, if you want to say, like they're suffering from their own egos and their own limitations.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, I mean, I am also a subscriber to Charles's kind of fundamental theory around the story of separation. And, if you're looking to kind of put your finger on, well, why is there, you know, environmental cataclysm, and why is there political discord, and why is there income inequality, and why is religion so fucked up? And it's like, if you really care about pedophilia, like look at institutional religion, not Joe fucking Biden. It's like, if you really care about it, go check out the Catholic Church for 10 minutes,
Yeah.
because that's the biggest actually proven widespread abuse. If you really want to rail against the mainstream media, why don't you talk to the Boston Globe, who uncovered the biggest pedophilia child abuse scandal ever in the Catholic Church? Not ever, but like, that whole movie
Huge.
Spotlight was made on that. So, but if you want to get behind, again, like these symptoms of like, well, why does capitalism breed, now 3 people in the United States that own more cumulative wealth than the bottom 50%? How did we end up there?
Mhm.
Well, how did we end up in, a society that essentially considers everything to be just disposable,
Mhm.
like, you know, all of this kind of, if you subscribe to Charles's theory, comes from a sense of separation, that we're separate from the mystical, we're separate from the divine, we're separate from nature, we're separate from one another. And of course, if you want to then go back farther, this of course is echoed in Eastern religions, Buddhism or Hinduism, in
Mhm.
which like the self is really just a modification of a greater, bigger self. you know but these ideas of kind of dismantling this notion of separation, and those are just kind of like big, huge philosophical ideas. you know like, I don't know, I don't profess to know like what is the thing is there some sort of inflection point that's going to like create some massive paradigm shift? I mean, to be honest, it's one of the things that's so, I suppose, heartening and disheartening at the same time is it was almost like COVID gave us this incredible opportunity to either unite or just like disintegrate into 1,000 shards of glass from a
Mhm.
broken face. And there are some societies that actually have cohered, you know, and not everyone's been happy all the time. I mean, there's been a lot of personal sacrifice in places like New Zealand, Norway, Taiwan,
Taiwan, yep.
Japan, etc. But largely, those places have found a sense of coherence,
Mhm.
of like they've reconnected to an idea that, quote unquote, we are one. That sounds a little Pollyanna, but there is a notion of the collective good, that my self interest and the collective good can be one and the same thing, that my well being is actually just a modification of a greater well being, that myself is a modification or some kind of like differentiation, vacillation of a greater self. Of course, the countries that sort of like value a rugged individualism, and civil liberties, the primacy of civil liberties beyond any, notion of the collective good, those are the societies that have really, really struggled. And
Sure.
so in a way, it's like, if I hadn't really thought about that before, but like, you know, COVID has given us this opportunity in some ways to really build and find community, really find and recognize collective good. But it's
Sure.
twisted, right? Because, in a way, like sometimes the messages is like, well, the best thing we can do for one another to build community
Mhm.
is actually to stay away from one another. That's like really hard to grapple with. Um, and it's just like
But
not
but it is, but
simple.
we do live in a paradox, right? Like, I mean, if you think about it, we live to die or do we die to live? And our very life is a fascinating experience of paradoxy. But I think what you're saying is interesting too, because we sometimes things have to break for them to put together. And I think also the other spectrum, you talk about the billionaires. I mean, why is it just the people who want to take advantage of the situation benefit from a crisis? Actually, people who are community builders can also take advantage of a crisis, right? The opposite
Mhm.
spectrum can also take advantage of a crisis. So,
Yeah, agreed. I mean, and yeah, I mean, I think it's like it's funny because that one particular example, this kind of distillation of income inequality in that one statistic of the three billionaires holding more cumulative aggregate wealth than the bottom 50%. Just that idea, that meme, if you will, is a completely uniting idea. I mean, whenever like I'm having a conversation that devolves into some sort of like invidious argument, I'm like, but what about that? We definitely agree about that, right? And there's always total, that is one place where there is tremendous agreement over the, across the right and the left, like what to do about it. I don't know, it's another kind of set of discussions, but I try to find sort of across these constellations of, of agreement in a otherwise kind of vast stormy sky, but that definitely seems you know to be one of them. And you're right. I mean, there are ways to. I mean, I'm not sure I would frame it as sort of take advantage of the system or of the situation, but I just look at like my own life over the last year. I had Wanderlust basically disintegrated, went away. We had a studio in Los Angeles that closed for good. We had at one point 68 events bringing together sort of like-minded progressive yoga people in 20 countries. Zero now, there's none, zero. So, my wife closed her studio, the aforementioned Kula studio that she started in early 2002. I had a tour with Russell Brand that disappeared. um, and my retreat center, which was booked every weekend for a year and a half, with fantastic teachers, all went away. So letting go of all of that stuff, but of course, like I know how fortunate, how lucky I am. So, you know, and I've also had to manage the disintegration of all of those things. At the same time, that also gave space for the opportunity of commune. Um, and, that concern has really, really grown, and it's served people during a time of great need. And so, but I'm lucky. I have that flexibility to be like, okay, I see where I can be most additive and useful to society. So I can swing my attention kind of over here, and, from my own purpose and sense of mission in the world, like I've been able to do that this year by just understanding where I can be the most helpful, where I can be the most useful. But that's an extremely rare and fortunate, position to be able to do that. But still, if you have your basic needs met, I'm like in a 200 square foot guest house, with like barely run, with basically no running water. If you have your basic needs met, I do think that you can leverage your own sort of creativity, your own energy to be a positive source for community building, a positive source for hope, a source of conversation for people. So yeah.
So that's my final question to you to end this is, and I think you might have already kind of suggested it with the basic needs thing, but you could massage that however you want. What is an idea that you'd like to share with everyone that would invoke political hope? Is there like a concept or an idea or something people can get behind?
Yeah. I think it's really the bravery and also the the wherewithal to step out of the political invective. Like, I think it has to start with some own internal inventory of like, why am I who I am? Like, what is my cloak of, who's responsible for sewing this cloak of identity that I'm wearing? My parents, my culture, my religion. Like, try to remove all those sheaths. I always use the metaphor of the Russian dolls. Like, try to get to that core of of awareness, of consciousness, and then build up patterns and build your identity, the contents of your consciousness from there, from a place of like real keen discernment. So there's a lot of self-work that has to be done, of like really developing critical thinking skills, of really developing your media literacy, of really developing um, not just knowledge, but like wisdom, which is almost in some ways it's not incongruent with knowledge, but it also is not really a quantified measurement of how much you know. In some ways, wisdom for me is like realizing what I don't know, where I am deficient, and actually surrounding myself with either people that can infill that deficiency, or really, building, or really being humble in that place, asking the questions why, and then really with as little cognitive bias as I possibly can, really educate myself around that. And then come to these salient and prescient issues from this place of sort of renewed discernment and humility, and be a vector for conversation from that place, instead of being sort of just a vector for a retweet or a meme, or some sort of like oversimplification of a complicated, nuanced issue, that then you become then a vector of that misinformation. And just because it gets 100 comments, it opens up some sort of like neural reward pathway in your brain. So then you're doing it again, and you're posting stuff that's even more ostentatious and hyperbolized with no sense if it has any basis in fact. Like, oh, get on, like, shed
Yes.
that, and really try to come, to our human interactions from a place of humility and discernment, and start there, um, and and engage.
That's awesome. I mean, and I'll leave it with this. One of my favorite meditations to teach teenagers and little kids. I love to do the I don't know meditation, where we just go, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. And I think just practicing, I don't know, like it's okay. Like you don't have to know. And once we're okay with
Try
that.
that when you have 3 kids. It's very difficult to do that. They're all looking at you like, wait, you're the male archetype. You're the paternal figure in my life. You're supposed to know everything.
You should try that try that sometime, Jeff, when they're coming at you with a ton of questions. Be like, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, and see what happens.
Yeah.
Let me
Well, I'll
know.
tell you, I know nothing about how to do their algebra. Huh. Awful.
Oh man, I've been teaching algebra and geometry over this pandemic. It's been interesting
Wow.
doing
Good
it.
for you. That's
Yeah.
amazing. Good for you.
It's been fun. I've been mixing in nature though. I've been like talking about nature and sacred geometry in the classes, which has kind of been helpful, obviously.
Yeah. I pray and hope that there's space for humor in this year, for laughter, for comedy, which is often a conduit for the truth, right? So it's like oftentimes a lot of this kind of like armor, the armor that we wear comes off a lot easier when there's something to laugh about. And it's hard to interject humor and comedy in a time that feels so wicked and grave, right? And when
Sure.
people are really like suffering, and obviously we have to be compassionate, not make light of that, but we also need to find ways to be light. I'll leave
Yes.
you with this one thing. I know you've got to go. Byron Katie is a like good friend of mine, um, and but before I really knew her well, I got this opportunity to have lunch with her. And so I was like, I'm not going to waste an opportunity with Byron Katie. I got to ask her something like fucking serious about her life. It's not going to be like, how's the salmon? So I was like, so Katie, like, what's enlightenment to you? And she's like, she like chews her food for a while. It's like, she's like off in outer space most of the time. It's like a nice place to be. And, you know, she just asks me like, well, what makes you feel light? And so, I'm like, well, it's like when I'm in connection with others, and when I'm playing sports, and when, like I'm in a conversation, I don't even have a sense of the heaviness of my body. Like, when I'm really animated, when I'm laughing, whatever. She's like, okay, what makes you feel heavy? It's like, oh, when I'm holding a grudge, or when I'm seeking revenge, or when I'm angry, or whatever. And she's like, it's so easy, Jeff. Enlightenment is just about doing the things that make you feel light. I'm like, all right, I'm in. Sign me up.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What a good setup. I love that. She's so wise. Oh my gosh. God bless her. Jeff,
All
thank you
right.
so much. You're awesome. I hope we can revisit this later when you keep building your communities and stuff. I want to find out what happens. And thank you so much for coming, and have a beautiful day and weekend. I hope you get in that house back in the house. I hope that. And by the way, lightning, wherever lightning strikes, and there's got to be some mythology going on with that for you, personal mythology. So good luck.
Yeah, I hate to debunk the divine myth of it. It's more like a fire in the cellar with a fondue of wires and cables. But still, I'll take a superpower. I think the superpower is just
Well,
being
we'll find out.
loyal.
You might need to. It might be fertilizer, so you have to wait a few months to experience. What happens.
Fair enough. Keep up the great work.
Take care, Jeff. Be well. Be blessed.